that would coordinate disaster risk management in the country, because we lacked that, Honorable Speaker, and we still lack. Honorable Speaker, I remember the time I came up with this bill was immediately after the Garissa University terrorist attack. And it was sad, Honorable Speaker, that at that time, and I would believe it's still the case today, in the absence of having a coordinated way in which we manage our disasters and management of risks that would contribute to more disasters. At that time, Honorable Speaker, I remember when the terrorists hit Garissa University, and so many students were shot, some killed, some injured, and you can imagine the anguish that parents had. Garissa at the time was around summer times in Kenya, Honorable Speaker, but temperatures soaring to highs of close to 40 degrees Celsius. And I had an engagement, Honorable Speaker, with the medical officer who was serving in the region at that time and coordinating that disaster from Garissa. And as sad as it was, Honorable Speaker, those who unfortunately lost their lives, upon their bodies being taken to the morgue at the Garissa District Hospital, as it were then, the morgue could not handle the number of bodies that were being taken there. And bodies by that evening had started decomposing. By the time the government was able to mobilize resources from Nairobi to fly to Garissa, to even get fingerprints from the bodies that were already decomposing, it was not even possible. And I was told by those who are in the medical profession, when bodies stay under such temperatures, they get disfigured. And therefore, even fingerprints were disfigured. And that's why you realize it took a long time for families who are already notified that they have lost their loved young ones at the university, but they could not be able to identify what body belonged to who. And imagine the anguish parents had. Some, I remember, are accommodated at Chiromo University, Chiromo campus of the University of Nairobi, and there are harrowing stories of parents being subjected to walk from Chiromo all the way to Nyayo Stadium every morning, going to wait for buses at the Nyayo Stadium to see if they would be able to identify those who are coming in buses from Garissa, be able to get information as to whether they have lost their loved ones. And eventually, Honorable Speaker, I remember I engaged with one parent who had traveled all the way from West Pokot, sold his 3 goats to get fare to come to Nairobi. And he exhausted the money that he had sold his 3 goats through trying to get accommodation in Nairobi, and had to walk every day when they were eventually hosted by the University of Nairobi in Chiromo. He had to walk every day for almost a week and a half before he finally identified his deceased child from Garissa University. And that motivated me, Honorable Speaker, to ask myself, what is it that we can do to ensure that if such a disaster ever struck again, there is a coordinated way in which we can handle such a disaster or others, Honorable Speaker. And from members' contributions, you can hear the anguish even ourselves as members of parliament have to go through every now and then, with simple disasters like the blowing off of roofs of our primary schools by strong winds, or floods. When floods ravage our constituencies, be it in Budalangi or somewhere in eastern Kenya, Kenyans are left suffering because there isn't a coordinated way through which government, both at the national level and at the county level, coordinates to handle disasters, Honorable Speaker. And therefore, we sought to have this bill, Honorable Speaker, to address some of these challenges, to ensure that we not only provide that legal framework for disaster risk management, but also to enhance the effectiveness and a coordinated disaster preparedness, how we prevent disasters, how we respond, mitigation and recovery from disasters, Honorable Speaker, because it is one thing to wait for disasters to happen, Honorable Speaker. We all know that for many years, Budalangi constituency has been ravaged by floods, or when River Nyando Nyado and Rivanzoia break their banks, people will suffer. And you remember the famous lady of Sirikali Saidia during the regime of President Mwai Kibaki. And that lady brought to the fore the suffering of the people of Budalangi from floods. And I remember government at that time moved from those calls to establish dikes and other mitigation measures, but we do not have to wait for Kenyans to cry out. We should be proactive. We should move ahead of time to see how we can not only prevent and mitigate disaster, but also ensure that Kenyans are able to recover quickly post-disasters, Honorable Speaker. And therefore, this bill seeks to address some of those issues and also to reduce disaster risks and vulnerabilities at the national and also at the county levels of government. Honorable Speaker, members are aware that every county government and even the national government has funds that are usually set aside for unforeseen emergencies. And these contingency funds, Honorable Speaker, are never utilized for the right purposes, and you find that a disaster hits a county and the county government of that particular county has no resources. Yet in their budgets, they had budgeted for a contingency fund for such eventualities and emergencies. By the time the disaster hits them, they are ill prepared and are always calling on the national government to come to their rescue. And therefore, we want to have a coordinated process so that we know how do we establish that each of our county governments are budgeting and providing funds for disaster mitigation and disaster management. How do we also ensure, as members of parliament who are in charge of budget making, that the contingency monies that are set aside to deal with disaster management are indeed appropriated for that particular purpose, Honorable Speaker, and also coordinate so that when it is a county level disaster or a disaster that is restricted within a particular county, the county can first utilize their resources before they go out to look for help. Honorable Speaker, also you have measures to know through a disaster management authority, Honorable Speaker, how can we even coordinate the mobilization of resources? Honorable Speaker, look at the COVID pandemic. We had, as a country, we had to set up an ad hoc committee, look for people in the private sector, in the corporate world, a few public officers, to form an ad hoc committee to mobilize resources to even be able to look for gloves and masks that were required to prevent loss of life, Honorable Speaker, and further spread of that disaster of COVID-19. Honorable Speaker, all these things have served to remind us as a country that we are always ill-prepared and we are caught flat-footed when disasters strike. And it is high time that we prepare in a way that we'll be able to enhance our own resilience to the impacts of disasters and other risks, and also issues that touch on climate change, Honorable Speaker. We are now in the discussions of climate change and, Honorable Speaker, how we mitigate issues to do with climate change. With the changing climate, Honorable Speaker, floods, hurricanes, Honorable Speaker, will become very common things. Honorable Speaker, if we don't take deliberate measures for reforestation, soil erosion, landslides will be so common, Honorable Speaker, and unless we have a system where there is somebody checking on what we are doing, both at the national level, at the county and local levels, Honorable Speaker, to ensure that even as we deal with climate change mitigation measures, we're also looking at the effects of that, the changes in our climate in matters touching on floods, as I said, soil erosion, washing away all the good soils and the nutrients that our crops need, Honorable Speaker, exposing us to other disasters such as hunger and droughts, Honorable Speaker. Landslides in those areas where they are prone to landslides, like in Murang'a County and other areas where Elgeyo Marakwet, Honorable Speaker, and West Pokot. You remember the disaster that struck us about 2 or 3 years ago. And I remember then, Honorable Speaker, when that disaster struck in West Pokot, even the minister who was in charge of the interior, the minister who was in charge of the small disaster unit that is hosted by the Ministry of Interior. I can't remember the name of that small unit, because there are small unit within the Ministry of Interior that deals with disasters. The minister in charge then, the Honorable former CS Fred Matiang'i, told the country unashamedly, Honorable Speaker, that he could not access the disaster area because of the weather at that time, flying a military helicopter. But the then Deputy President, with a small civilian helicopter, was able to access that place, Honorable Speaker. And that also speaks to the disdain and contempt that some of our public officers had with Kenyan people, that we do not relate to the suffering of the people when disasters strike. It took the then Deputy President, who is now serving as our President, flying a private chopper and even mobilizing private resources from Kenyans to be able to help the people of West Pokot then. And I was praying the Member of Parliament from that area was here, Honorable Speaker, because we do not know when such other disasters will strike. But we do not want to find ourselves in a situation where our current Minister for Interior will claim that because of weather, when he has choppers that have navigation equipment, he could not access a certain place because there is no proper framework as to how you respond to such disasters. And we want to find ourselves well prepared, Honorable Speaker. Honorable Speaker, I do agree with the committee's report that indeed, on hindsight, there are certain changes that we can make to this bill, and I agree with them on the deletion of some of the clauses, like clause 5, 6, and 7, that touch on the establishment of an intergovernmental council that will comprise 10 members. And I want to thank the committee and the chair, Honorable Chakapunga, and say I do agree with them, and we will support the amendments that they have proposed during committee of the whole. Honorable Speaker, with those many remarks, I beg to support, as I also thank the many members who have spoken in support of this bill. Honorable Speaker, finally, because we are at a